Donna.
All right, yeah, I'm sitting down with Kirsten and Rosie, two of our team members. We're trying to do a monthly wrap up for the month of March. We're still in March, but March is coming to a close here really quick, and we've been exploring, talking about the idea of healthy sexuality. It's been amazing for me as an interviewer. I've had the chance to talk to some really amazing people. I don't know how the audience has taken things, but for me, it's been like I've been learning a ton. I've really come away from every interview like, yeah, like wow, that was good stuff. So we had a chance to connect with a couple Bethel leaders, and then also we're able to talk to somebody outside of our environment. We always love that. They're bringing maybe a fresh perspective or a different view than what we're used to talking about so regularly at Bethel. And yeah, some really cool stuff was standing out to me as I think about it. And again, like we'll lead with that thought. The hope and the goal of these moments is to like learn, not so much to put forward like this is the way to think about something, but more like, hey, we want to like learn about a subject. And so there might have even been some different ideas in the interviews. Anyways, I loved it. It's been fun. How about you guys? Anything that stood out to y'all in the kind of month that just transpired? I think we had 4 different interviews set up. Kirsten, I
Yeah,
think, okay, Rosie, we're starting with you. Go for it.
I think this signal's going to be interesting. There's a bit of a delay. Yeah, the one that that really stood out to me was the Colin Kaelin interview. Just some pieces of information that I'd never heard, and it was very countercultural what you are educated in growing up, especially if you grew up outside the church. But just the idea that like a sex drive isn't necessarily an instinct. I mean, you come born with a sex drive, but like the fact that you don't know how to act upon it from birth says that it's actually a learned behavior. So you get hence you get like different people acting out their sexuality so differently throughout life.
Yeah.
And it's so much based on education, which is just being thrown at us from all directions, whether or not we realize it.
Yeah.
I thought that was, yeah, it was definitely, it's a game changer, I think, because for people who lean on that crutch of, using it as an excuse. I think I've heard a lot of men use this as an excuse of like, oh, men are just different to women. We're more like visually driven, and we're more like, even the argument where it's kind of, men can impregnate like physically, they can they can procreate more than a woman can in her lifetime.
Okay.
So even that has been used as an excuse from what I've heard over the years. So that idea is very much a game changer. So it was really interesting.
Yeah, and love that statement. We're trained by what we're entertained by. And so that idea of like culture is training humanity on what sexuality should be or is, or what normal equals. Actually, it's less instinctive and more learned. And then you kind of take a few steps backwards where are you learning? Like who's actually training you? And the reality is probably culture is training us much more than our core values or our internal sort of construct. It's probably more like we're under the influence. Yeah, I thought that was a really big point. I mean, it's probably a good segue to talk about the next interview we did with Jason and Lauren Valentine. I think that's how we opened the month up. And they had some really good thoughts on like parenting within sexuality. Anything that stood out to you from that interview, Kirsten, talking to Jason and Lauren?
Yeah, it was just an incredible interview. Just the whole month has just been so full of really great insight and wisdom. So lots of things to learn and glean from, like all the speakers. I really enjoyed just Lauren and Jason, just how they were focusing a lot on just family and marriage, and just the gift of intimacy, how we're hardwired for that, and just how we are gifts to each other as like husband and wife, and just kind of the goal of just like healthy relationships sexually, and and just that flow on and how it can impact your family as a whole. And there's a lot that stuck out to me with just identity as well, and just how we're kind of hardwired. Like I think when we're younger, we have like this idea of like being in love. Like we love the idea of being in love, and just how culture can kind of just push this whole image or like story of like what is love through television or, you know, society in general. And there's like a lot of pressure for like younger people that like are maybe single and just trying to like, I don't know, like get through high school, go into college and just kind of focus on bigger things, but then have that pressure of like, of that idea of like having to find a relationship, having to start. I mean, that's obviously a beautiful goal, but there's also like this pressure that like a lot of people may feel when it might not be the right one, or, you know, that kind of thing. So yeah, it's just kind of interesting, the idea of being in love and then actually saving yourself for that person and the beauty that can flourish. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so much pressure therein. Like if you're single at whatever stage of life, whether you're a teenager, a young adult, or maybe even somebody that's more in their like genuine adult years, yeah, that pressure and the idea of my match and who do I fit with, and how much of that idea is influenced by some of these ideas and culture that may not be necessarily healthy. I like the statement that they made: sex isn't intended to push a relationship forward. And yet in culture, that is very much the norm. Like in common or secular culture, sex would very much be like, no, that's the natural next step. Like if we're committed to each other, we're going to become sexually intimate, sexually active with each other. And whether or not is that a good process to be engaged in or not? Is that healthy or not? I don't know. There's a lot to unpack. There are some really interesting ideas, but again, back to your thought of like the way culture sells and pushes love and infatuation, and maybe it's more about a physical draw than it is like a holistic, like spirit, soul, body at times. I guess it depends on the season of life you're in, right? Yeah, they had a lot of good stuff to say. I don't know if there's anything to chime in on there from your thinking, Rosie, as you're hearing us chat.
And I was just thinking of that point you just made about how it's used to like further a relationship. So I was just the other day I came across this she's quite a young woman still back in England, and she's famous for being on a reality TV show, but prior to all that, she actually experienced what we come across and we're hearing about more and more with youth, which is she was pressured by this guy. He was like the popular kid in school, to send a picture of herself naked over text message. And his ploy, you know, his lure of bringing her into that was like, oh, it will make me like you so much more, you know.
Wow.
And I think to anybody, you know, anybody who likes somebody, there's that natural desire to make it more intense and deeper, you know. And it's crazy to think that like even at that young age, this boy knew how to use that to his advantage, you know. But it is something that's very much at play, I think, whether it's conscious or subconscious. So
yeah, and I recall them talking a lot about values and the idea that we are sexual beings, and it is very natural to have a process of learning, exploring, discovering, you know, what's healthy, what's unhealthy about our sexual drive or our sexuality. I feel like probably out of all the interviews, that conversation with Jason and Lauren was maybe like framing more, like really like, okay, here's some parameters, here's some boundaries. A lot of good information in there. And I think when they're talking about the idea of parenting sexuality, So recognizing that your children are sexual beings, they're going to be developing as sexual beings, emerging in their sexuality. A lot of their thoughts felt really healthy in the sense of like, hey, we kind of steer away from the idea of having the talk, because the talk is so rigid. The talk is like a moment. It's typically never goes very well. It's like the parents are nervous. The kids are like, God, what are we even talking about here? And they were more talking about the idea of like, hey, this is going to unfold. It's going to like happen over time. And is the door open to actually have dialogue? Yeah, they had a lot of really good stuff to say there. I think that's a good segue to get into the Donna Frida's interview. I found that incredibly enlightening, stimulating. I was like, I wanted to talk to her for hours, probably again, more so because she's outside of our environment. And I'm always spending a lot of time with Bethel leaders. I love Bethel leaders and definitely have nothing against Bethel leaders, but it is refreshing, like talking to people that are outside of our environment and may have some different ideas than we're normally kind of unpacking. You know what I mean? That was a fun interview. She's written several books, over 10 books, speaks at, I mean, her resume is like, she's spoken at over 200 universities, and she's like professor emeritus in several of them. And man, she had a lot of really cool stuff to say. And again, it was refreshing to me because it was a lot of newer ideas. She wrote this book. I want to just remind our audience, The End of Sex, how hookup culture is leaving a generation unhappy, sexually unfulfilled, and confused about intimacy. And she had these, she drew some pretty big ideas about like two polar opposites of one being hookup culture and the other being purity culture, and that both are kind of two ends of a pole around the idea of sexuality. She was speaking mostly to young adults, so probably 18 to 20 something year olds, and how both contain the same dynamics of very rigid ideas that are essentially thrust upon individuals, and they're sort of, force fed. This is the way to behave. This is the way to act, or this is the way to think. Again, maybe back to Colin Kaelin's idea of these are learned behaviors more than they're instinctive. And so she was talking about the dynamics of within hookup culture, you're expected to act a certain way. And, hookup apps that are, definitely intended not to produce commitment or long-term relationships, but apps that are much more designed to like just have meaningless flings that are definitely sexual in nature. And how when she went and interviewed the masses, she discovered within that kind of demographic of young adults, a lot of unrest, a lot of hunger, a lot of disappointment, discouragement, not a lot of fulfillment, not like a bunch of young people, young adults that are like, we love this, but more like this isn't working. And then on the other end of the scope, talking to mostly, it sounds like Christian universities, and the idea of purity culture being something that, again, she's just more like a sociologist, researcher, writer, and she's just interviewing people, not without any sort of like prescribed answers. She's just asking them about like, okay, what's your normal? And she hears from people within, Christian circles that the idea of purity culture in general is not empowering. It's very rigid. It's kind of like, this is the way to act. And if you don't, what she discovered was a lot of people being thrown under the bus, like maybe people that are crossing the line into being sexually active, being heavily judged, whatever, the proverbial scarlet letter being sewn on their back within church kind of context dynamics. And again, for both demographics, it's just people that feel very unempowered, people that don't really know their way. And there's this dynamic of they're trying to find their way. And so her and I had a really good conversation basically about trust, empowerment, the idea of relational ethics. And she said over and over and over again, I love this. She's like, nobody honestly, she's like, I just operate with the assumption that humans are after the best. Primarily speaking, people are trying to do their best. And so to assume the worst about others is like a terrible foot to start off on. And when she's referring to relational ethics, she's making this very big, huge statement that generally speaking, all of us are operating within a relational ethic where we want people to be okay. Our goal is not to disrespect them. Our goal is not to undercut them. Our goal is for whatever interactions we have to be with them to end up in like, oh, I'm thriving, or that was beneficial to me. So again, back to Jay and Lauren and the idea of like, you don't really have a talk, you have a lifestyle of dialogue. And I just thought she drew a really good point of like, yeah, if we're not empowering our youth or emerging young adults and trusting them to go off and make discoveries that are consistent with the relational ethic that we believe they're good people and they're gonna end up finding their way, then are we really doing a good job as leaders, you know? So I don't know, a lot to say there. I really found that time with her really, really inspiring. She had a lot of good stuff to say. Her Instagram, Donna Frida.writer, is a good thing to writer as in writing, W-R-I-T. Yeah, a lot of good stuff there. I don't know if you guys have any reactions, responses. I said a bunch, basically just like try to summarize the whole conversation I had with her.
Yeah, it was all really good information. I remember one piece from her interview at the beginning. I think she was at a university, and she actually was talking about how she would broach the idea with this university of the student body of, you know, you actually don't have to go along with everything that's being posed to you by your partner. You know, you actually can say no. And it was like surprising to them, like, and it's so interesting, isn't it? Because like in the church versus the world, it's like they almost look at us like the really rigid, you know, just, you know, high, like increasingly liberal kind of culture that we live in. The idea of empowerment is super big, and like, you know, your sexuality, like just live it out how you choose and however you want. But without realizing it, they're actually not living it out how they want, because so many, I'll say girls in particular, I think they kind of feel that they have to go along with certain things for their partner's sake. And then for men, I think they feel the pressure by their buddies, you know, have to done certain things by a certain age or whatever. And so I think that's like a huge pressure. So really everyone's just kind of puppets on a string to some extent, you know. But we're all kind of dealing with similar issues, just, you know, different, like you said, different ends of the spectrum.
Yeah, we're such social animals. And so again, back to instinctive versus instructed, like what are the standards? What are we influenced by? What are we actually learning about the subject of sexuality, being sexually active, being monogamous, holding, you know, waiting for the one person I want to be committed to life for the rest of my life, or vice versa. And again, like stepping back, what is culture training us? Who are people in our lives that really have influence over what our norms become? That's a big thought that I don't think is discussed enough, that people in a quote unquote secular context feel just as much pressure, and it's just a different kind of pressure. And you mentioned females, but speaking as a male who definitely had, you know, a life before Christ, no, I think normal, like cultural norms would be, you know, you're definitely celebrated or vilified based on the level of your sexual activity. You know, being a virgin, at least as I was coming of age, is definitely not something that would have been celebrated. And then amongst your peers, male to male, there definitely is a dynamic where sexual conquest, the idea of even how many women you're sleeping with, all those things are like social norms. It's not something that somebody would, generally speaking, stand up and resist. You'd probably be going, if you're going with the flow would look like multiple partners. Going with the flow would be like, very sexually active. And I love the film that Exodus Cry put out, Liberated, the new sexual revolution, and how it's so clearly put on display. One of the main characters is very sexually active, and we know him post the film, and he says back, he's like, listen, I acting that way, literally try to try to gain acceptance. I felt like it's what was expected of me. I was just going along with the kind of party line, you know what I mean? But if you're watching the film as an observer, you wouldn't think that. You just think this guy is such a womanizer. He's just totally exploiting women, objectifying them, taking advantage of them. And so, yeah, I think there's more going on than meets the eye. And there's things that like under the surface. And again, I think the value of these conversations is hopefully to equip people, empower people to have, develop their own values and have a sense of like, here's what's okay for me and here's what's not okay for me. And I would hope that we could like wrap around each other, support each other, respect each other, instead of like stand up and tell people this is the way to act, you know? So I thought, a lot of value in that Donna conversation. I wanted to like at least scratch the surface of entering into some of like same-sex attraction. That's a very prevalent dynamic in our generation. I don't think it's new to right now. I think things around gender identity is new to right now, but I think historically, we've seen same-sex attraction through all the ages, and so it's not something unique to today. However, something unique is going on in our generation, and so it's like I wanted to explore that. We interviewed some leaders from the change movement, Elizabeth Wanning, Ken Williams. I thought it was a great conversation. I think the way they're approaching the landscape of same-sex attraction and the dynamics therein, just a lot of grace, a lot of compassion. They are standing up with like, hey, following Jesus does create an alternative to that lifestyle of homosexuality, but they don't lead with that. They lead more with like, what's your story? Who are you? There was a lot that we discussed. I think some of the things that felt like kind of baseline or summary type statements was the breakdown in family and the idea that family does include a mother and a father. And Elizabeth made the really good point, like, hey, it's not just about fatherlessness being an epidemic in our generation, but it really is about familyness, or the breakdown of family being an epidemic in our generation. And, the lack of male and female, mom and dad, definitely has an impact. And that impact is people struggling with their identity or having a sense of who am I. I love that statement Ken made. He was talking about, man, I just wanted a male that was stronger than me and kind enough to hold me and nurture me and pour into me. And I didn't have that. And as a result of not having that, as well as he had crossed the line, like opened a portal and viewed very violent gay porn at a very young age. And that open door and invited him into a whole world where that same-sex attraction, homosexuality became something that was like a major life struggle for him. But at the end of the day, he was like, no, I just needed a man to hold me, to nurture me, to affirm me, to let me know that, I was okay and I was going to be okay. Yeah, there was a lot there. I don't know if there's any comments that you guys have with that idea of the LGBT conversation, same-sex attraction.
Yeah, just coming back to like family and just the roles and society and just kind of the things that are happening. There's like a lot of talk about like fatherlessness, but if you look at the like situations that children are growing up in and just having like their mothers are actually super busy, kind of almost like you'd hear like the saying like absent father, but there's also like absent mothers too. So
Yeah.
A lot of children are growing up in homes and without either role model really, because the mothers are so busy.
Sure.
Going to work, 2 jobs sometimes, coming home, and sometimes the fathers aren't involved at all. And so there's just like a lot of kids that are just getting raised up and then getting exposed to what's on the computers, and they're raising our children. And it's a really sobering fact, just within the dynamics of society and family breakdown, and just the importance of bringing that back.
It's good.
Yeah, no, that must leave like such a void as well, you know, for a child growing up. Like that's where you get all of your, initially at least, like your sense of belonging and being accepted and loved and valued. And so, you know, if that's not being filled in a healthy way from a young age, there's just such a void there to be filled by relationship, or, you know, for kids, like as they do start to like move towards each other as they grow up and become you know, sexually mature. It's obviously like that's the natural latch on, which doesn't fill that void at all, but it's kind of like acts as some level of like acceptance and feeling of belonging, you know.
Absolutely.
So,
yeah, I mean, there's true, like there's a lot there. The physiological nature, there is definitely a high level of connection, endorphins in the sexual act. So something is happening in terms of filling some of those holes. But if it's outside of the context of a committed relationship where people are actually walking with each other and facing each other, it sets people up for so much more disaster, so many more of those gaps widening in terms of acceptance, belonging, feeling seen, wanted. Yeah. I think a lot of what I saw as a thread running through every conversation is this idea of teaching, learned behavior. What are our standards? What is normal? What are we going to say yes to because it's a part of our values and we value it, versus what are we just going to go along with because culture tells us that that's the way, walking it. And again, like setting up our lives as Jesus followers in such a way that there's space for people to make discoveries. Like we trust each other, we're empowering in people's lives. There's a natural grace and compassion about us when people are navigating that road that helps us fall into conversations with each other instead of setting up these like rigid poles of this is okay, this is not okay. And then we're actually creating more disconnection or greater lack of intimacy for people that really, they need the intimacy. Like they need the moments to process. They need access to human beings that can listen and process and be affirming and nurturing, even if they're struggling and like wrestling with things, right? So I don't know. I mean, I have my own mindset on how to wrap up the month, but I just feel like that's, to me, I'm like, I want to be that person in the earth, and I want to be approachable. I want to help people maybe listen to suggestions of things that might work otherwise if they're currently finding out things don't work. You know what I mean? But as the church, I don't want to be the judger. You know, I don't want to tell people like you're wrong. I just want to create a space for people to process and experience love and nurturing. And yeah, that conversation might include like, well, how's that working out for you? Like the decisions you're making right now, like, are you fulfilled? And is being sexually active outside of marriage really fulfilling for you and working in terms of who you want to become? And yeah, I don't know. There's a lot to talk about. Good details, good thoughts. You guys have anything as we're wrapping up, closing?
I think just like you know, because when I came to Bethel, I remember just hearing stories of people that had, you know, like they'd gotten themselves into situations that were not, you know, obviously them thriving.
Yeah.
But I remember hearing how leadership wrapped around them, and it was such a new idea to me that it, you know, because like we can be super harsh in the church. It's kind of like, you know, like shun them kind of thing. And, you know, actually you're right, like that's not what people need. That creates even more of a disconnect of intimacy, and intimacy is just, you know, it's an outlet for things that are, you know, sexual intimacy, at least it's an outlet for something going on internally that's out of place or missing. So, you know, pushing that person even further away is not loving them. It's not going to solve the problem of immorality in the church. It's not going to solve the problem, you know, of people acting out in wrong ways. So I just, and I know that to people looking like from the outside looking in, it's like, oh, well, they condone that. And it's not the case, because you can hold someone to account in love, but actually what account looks like is actually loving them and seeing where the needs are. And yeah, they do have to clear up their mess, but it's, that's not the main focus, is not like punishing, and it's not like, it's making sure they don't do it again, but because of something that got fixed internally, not like just even more restriction on their behavior, So I think like, for other churches or Christians watching, it's, that's going to be the main thing that we all have to kind of learn to grow in, I think, is helping people heal in love and doing that through community.
Yeah, I think like Holy Spirit is really good at convicting where conviction needs to come, and like our job is and role as a body of Christ to love each other, pull each other up. And I just think of that verse that talks about like, you might see that splinter or speck in your other brother's eye, but there's like a log in your own. Like, we just need to be walking in love, and sin is sin. And no matter if it's a sexual sin and you're choosing to walk, however that way, or if you're, going to go do something really horrible to someone else, like, so of course there's like God's like laying in forward and bringing us into an invitation of like an intimate relationship with him, and just walking with his way is always the best way, but our job is just to love. So, and walk as he would walk, and like, follow me as I follow Christ kind of example. Like, we want to be doing that as the body of Christ, not like pointing out where everyone's wrong or living this way or that way.
It's good. Yeah, I think another really important dynamic in this is the like spirit, soul, body dynamic of the act of sex, that having sex with another human being, like there's a real spiritual soul dynamic at play. It's not just physical. And the idea of like, God wanting the best for his people, for every human. Uncommitted relationships where sexual activity is the norm, it just leads to a lot of pain. There's a lot of stop-start. There's a lot of brokenness. There's a lot of soul void that only widens. And sex was meant to be something that like closes that gap and that chasm, and that like the two shall become one is, it's very much the commitment of marriage, but it's also very much the act of marriage, which is sexual intimacy. And two becoming one, if you're sexually active and not committed, and you're sexually active with multiple partners, like you're just setting yourself up for so much psychological damage and so much soul pain and so much rejection. And I was just like, as a dad, and I'm like, obviously this much of a dad compared to the father, he's just like, dude, I don't want people living in that sort of recourse, and that roller coaster and the gaps and the pain. And I think, when I was younger and being trained by my culture, I had no idea about that dynamic. The physical act of sex had, all kinds of levels of satisfaction and pleasure. And a lot of that was emotional. It wasn't just a physical thing. And I understood that as a young 20-year-old walking away from those, those moments, like, dude, something just happened that doesn't happen in just like a friendship, you know what I mean? But then you're not aware, because your culture doesn't teach you, that you're like, now you're connected to that individual, and there's going to be like a lasting impact and result. And then, if the relationship's not going anywhere, the pain that ensues. And so you get making a big point that sex is more than a physical act, and just how we're spirit, soul, body. And it is one of those, I think God has created us to be sexual beings, because it is one of those like truly sacred experiences and functions of humanity. It very unique and very blessed, and absolutely something that God intends to be taking place in humans' lives, All right, well, yeah, that was good. It was fun having those conversations with some people who had a lot of authority and a lot of voice in that space. So I think we're wrapping that up and saying adios. We will next month. We're going to be exploring criminal justice system. So I feel like there's a lot to unpack there. I know there's a lot of different views and opinions and leaders that are active in the criminal justice space, and hopefully we'll be learning some good stuff. Kirsten, Rosie, thanks for jumping in with me on this one. I'm going to say goodbye. I don't know if you want to say anything else. Parting words.
Not really.
No, just smiles.
See you.
Just smiles. That's great. Great. Thanks, ladies. And we'll see you guys next time. Peace.